Working together to make a better community. We can create a
Welcome
brighter
to
day.
Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Lise Vaugeois, who is the MPP for Thunder Bay Superior North and the NDP critic for seniors, workers' compensation, and injured workers. Lise, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Steve.
It's so great to have you here, and let's just start a little bit with your background. Did you grow up in Thunder Bay? Give us a little bit of your personal history.
All right. No, I did not grow up in Thunder Bay, but I have been here for over 30 years now. I moved here originally to play French horn with the symphony, professional symphony orchestra, and I loved that. And also, I wound up really making Thunder Bay my home. And since then, I've done lots and lots of work in the schools, music projects in the schools.
That's where we first met because one of my kids was in one of your classes.
Right, yes. So I had enough instruments that I built and collected to keep 60 kids busy and making music. So yeah, I did that for quite a while. I also, before coming to Thunder Bay, I toured with a professional brass quintet throughout most of Canada, Japan, the United States. We did quite a lot. And then, I'll get this all mixed up, the order, but ultimately I did a Master's of Education at Lakehead, and then I did a PhD at the University of Toronto, and I studied colonization through the lens of music and culture to try and understand how the relationships came to be the ones that are here. How is it that it's normal that there's a whole group of people, Indigenous people who live on reservations, on reserves? How did that come to be? What holds those inequalities in place? So that's what I studied for my PhD. And then I was teaching at Lakehead, teaching future educators. And at some point, somebody approached me about possibly running for the NDP. I'd been a member for a long time. And I took my first run at it about 5 years ago, and that went quite well, really. And then I had the opportunity to work with the Thunder Bay and District Injured Workers group, which was wonderful. And now, of course, I was elected last June, and I feel like the Thunder Bay and District Injured Workers group has been a big part of my education about what kind of issues people with severe injuries are facing, and what supports are not there that are supposed to be there, but really have not been there for some time.
Well, as many of our viewers will know, I've been active with the Thunder Bay Injured Worker Support Group for almost 40 years. It'll be 40 years in January. So we had a really good connection there. Now, in a way, I'm wondering about what the link is between, that experience with workers who maybe are getting a bit of a raw deal, along with our Indigenous folks who definitely got a raw deal. Is that part of your reason to go into politics? What was behind that?
I've been aware of really systemic inequality for a long time. For me, I needed to go to school to figure out how all those pieces fit together. What are the histories? What institutions were put in place at different times that today still hold those inequalities in place? So with Indigenous people, you really look at the origins of Canada, what kind of laws were put in place at that time that really cemented inequality and oppression for Indigenous people. And so it's not, we know how many terrible forms of oppression took place. The residential schools were just one piece of that. There were other things going on before and since. But with that information, then it, it's easier. Well, I wouldn't say it's easier, but you can start to then conceptualize and think about what needs to change to really make a difference. And sometimes it's attitudes, but it's not usually just attitudes. It's something in the way that the system has been designed that, holds those forms of oppression in place. And then attitudes are part of it because they kind of allow those things to continue operating in the background. Now, in the case of injured workers, we know that, it's 100 years ago, maybe a little more than 100 years ago, that Sir Meredith, set up the Workers' Compensation Board on the principle that, well, first of all, workers wouldn't have to sue their employers. But at the same time, employers would all be paying into a pot that would be there to support workers so that workers would not be a burden, injured workers not a burden on their families or on society at large. But we know that that's changed really, really significantly, and that it is now operating almost like a commercial insurance company. And that was not the purpose. So when it operates as a commercial insurance company, then they're looking for reasons not to support people. How can we eliminate our numbers and not support people? Well, that's really not what it was intended to do. So that really fills me with rage, I have to say. And then you see different very specific kinds of government policies that are there. So we saw, this year, cost of living allowance, injured workers were shortchanged on that, and now are forced to then launch court challenges. Well, that costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of effort, and in the meantime, you're missing the money. Those workers are missing that money. So that's not fair. And then to see a huge, it's been called a surplus, but knowing how many workers are struggling to even have their claims acknowledged, I find it hard to believe that that was a surplus. But it was handed back to employers, and also their contributions have been reduced. And those are political decisions. They tell you that, okay, we're really encouraging business, but business doesn't exist without a healthy workforce. The only way it does is if you've got so many workers that you can afford to throw them out when they cease to be useful to you. That is what we're seeing, is a sense that, okay, well, these people are expendable, we can throw them out. We see the same thing happening with people on ODSP. And we also know that injured workers who should be entitled to support from what is now called the Workers' Safety Insurance Board wind up having to apply for ODSP, which we also know isn't enough to live on.
Exactly. And now on that, we need to take a short break. Please stay with us, and we're going to be right back with lots of good information.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Lise Vaugeois, who is our member of Provincial Parliament for Thunder Bay, Superior North, and the NDP critic for seniors, the WSIB, and injured workers. So we were just talking really about injured workers and some of the challenges that are happening now. There's an event coming up where there's going to be a little bit of a spotlight on workers who have died on the job and are injured. April 28th, National Day of Mourning. how does that impact you that day, and the ceremonies that we have coming up?
It's a very important day. It's a very moving day. And it's probably before I started working with the injured workers, it's probably not something I was really aware of. People do experience injuries as musicians, but it doesn't get taken up in the same way necessarily, or different kinds of injuries. So the first time I went to the day of mourning, I was really moved, shocked at the numbers. So it's an important event. It's an important time for injured workers to speak on behalf of their own situations. It's an important reminder for people who, most of us imagine that we're always going to be healthy. If you start out, I've been lucky, I've been able-bodied, I am still able-bodied, and it's easy to think it's never going to happen to me. And then when you hear people speak and you realize how quickly and easily a very serious injury can take place, or exposure to chemicals in the workplace that can have really life-changing effects. So I think it's a really important event. Can I say that Marit Stiles will be
Yes,
coming?
by all means.
So she's the new leader of the provincial NDP, and she will be speaking at the Day of Mourning. I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to say something else too that really worries me. So there is a lot of talk and encouragement for young people to enter the trades today, and that's exciting. I think it can be very rewarding work, interesting work. But we also know that young people are the most likely to have an accident in their very early in their careers as workers. And I'm worried about that because I know that the WSIB is not necessarily going to be there to support them. So then you have young people and their families really getting invested in having their, working relatively young without those supports there. So when the government has introduced these working for workers bills, and there's nothing there that really seriously addresses the problems with WSIB, or even the problems with holding companies to account, and we know there's certain companies with really very bad records, then to me that's not working for workers. It's an appearance of working for workers, but it's really leaving out some of the most important changes that need to take place. And in some respects, I want to say changes back to at least the principles that were laid down over 100 years ago.
Well, you hit on a sore point. I mean, my oldest grandson is a carpenter apprentice. Actually, he just took his Red Seal exam last week. Mm-hmm. But in his first year on the job, I'm always talking to him about safety, and he says, "Oh yeah, it's safe." And then I ask a little bit more. He says, "Well, they were working in a tunnel, and working on the ceiling." And he says, "Well, except stuff kept on falling off the scaffold, and I almost got hit, and actually the foreman got hit with something and got hurt." Mm-hmm. And you kind of go, well, then why are you saying it's safe? Mm-hmm. Really because he hasn't been hurt yet.
Yes.
And to try to get that culture in there that this is something you have to be conscious of all the time, and thinking about you and the people around you, mm-hmm. For that safety piece. So here you are, you've really taken in these experiences, and now you're our elected representative. You've just changed your critics portfolio to include the WSIB and injured workers. What what can you do in the House as our member to kind of raise these issues? How do you approach that?
So there are several ways. As a member of the opposition, there's certain things open to me. So I certainly try to communicate. I can try to communicate directly with ministers and try and have meetings. Also, in question period, I can raise difficult questions, and then there are also debates. For example, the various Working for Workers bills. Then I've spoken to those a number of times during debates, and usually I may have as long as 20 minutes to speak to that. And then there's also the option of bringing in private members' bills. So I will be reintroducing Bill 125, which was introduced a number of years ago by Wayne Gates, and it really addresses chemical exposures and making it easier for those claims to be recognized, because we know that people sometimes wait 10 years, 15 years. I'm thinking the folks in Dryden who worked at Weyerhaeuser. What was that, 2002 to 2004? The
Exactly
exposures
right.
took place.
Yes.
And those effects have still not been recognized. That's horrible. So, my role is so I can make noise in various ways in the legislature, and also create pressure by using opportunities to speak to the media. And of course, we have our social media. Really, you're always looking for ways, how can I create more pressure to see something really genuinely change? And it's a challenge. It is a majority Conservative government. So I can be right. I can make a really strong case. But still, it takes more than, it takes a lot, right? It takes public pressure as well. So anytime that we can make the public aware of how serious this is, it's not like injured workers are some kind of little subset that's off to the side that doesn't really matter, because it can be anybody who has experienced a workplace injury and winds up having to go through appeal after appeal after appeal.
And now we need to take another little break.
Okay.
Lise, please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Working together to make a better community. We can create.
Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Lise Vaugeois, our MPP from Thunder Bay, Superior North. And Lise, one of your jobs as critic for the NDP is with WSIB and injured workers. We've been talking about that. We're both have a history together around that, and so from the Thunder Bay Injured Workers Support Group, we're so happy to have you in the House representing us, and we thought that the job you've done is so great so far. We watch Hansard and see some of your speeches, which is great. And you mentioned sometimes people think, injured workers are this one little crew. According to Stats Canada, there's 600,000 workers with a permanent, lifelong disability from work in Ontario today. So in a way, you've now been in Parliament for 9-10 months. What are your reflections from that your first year on the job there?
There are lots of challenges. And I have to say, when you start, Jamie West, who is our labor clinic, he's been there longer than me, and he said, when you first start, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's really a lot of information very quickly. Some of it's procedural, some of it's political, some of it is just, figuring out where you're supposed to be. So I'm now at the point where, I pretty much know what's going on, and I'm no longer daunted by the idea of having to put together a 20-minute speech, for example. I have yet to be asked to do a 1-hour speech. I think I'm just as well. But you see what's possible, what might be possible, given enough pressure. Also to always to be looking for, is there someplace where we can come together with the other members of the House, whether we're in different parties or not, to make something happen that's positive for people. I'm not convinced. I think we are going to see a few positive things come out. I'm not seeing any movement whatsoever towards improving things for people with permanent injuries. I see a lot of still, we know also the AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, that the latest report has come out of there and it's scathing. That, I know the government is doing some things to make things more accessible, but we tried to bring in a motion that would say, you actually need to get feedback from people who are using the services, and then give a report in a year, and then let's figure out what can be changed. Now, they were not agreeable to doing that, which I think is really, it's really a pity, because even myself, as a person who's dragging a suitcase around with me everywhere I go, I really notice that there's a lot that's not accessible. And it winds up, that lack of accessibility really, again, it hurts people. It keeps people isolated. It keeps people locked in their homes sometimes, particularly when, also the various lift services and so on that are there are not always very flexible. So, and really, you're there and you're hearing from people all the time as well. Right? So we get a lot of, and mostly you hear from people when something's not working, right? But people are really struggling on a lot of areas. So I have learned that, politics is a game of strategy. I hope that we will be finding out what the mandate letters actually say for the members of the Conservative government. I think they will say privatize, 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 because those are the kind of bills that we've been seeing coming forward. And in the case of a majority government, what I'm also learning is we've got to mobilize people on the streets, in their workplaces, so that we are not passively accepting what comes from government. And I know it's like listening to question period, following answer. It's a lot of work for people, who already have a lot to do just to get by in their daily lives. But what happens is actually really, really important. Really affects what is possible. So I know, I see my role as being a voice for people, for the people who don't get heard as often and as they deserve to be heard. And I feel like the longer I'm at it, the better I get at it. I'm comfortable speaking now in the House and advocating and simply not accepting legislation that's going to harm people. Now, again, they have the majority. They can push these things through, but we were successful with, I'll forget the bill, but with when the education workers were about to have their charter rights removed and forced to accept bad bargaining, and there was enough organization that that the government was forced to rescind that bill. That was a really important moment. And I think we probably have to do that again concerning healthcare. And we can't afford to be passive about it. We need to have conversations with our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, so that people really understand what's at stake and get involved.
So speaking of getting involved, and we're just down to our last minute or so, if people want to get involved and want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can send an email to my constituency office, or you can call. And I don't know whether we can post any of this online.
We can do that.
The phone number is 807-345-3647. I won't say the email because I've got 5 vowels in my last name and it's too complicated. But and I have really, really wonderful staff. And staff can sometimes, my constituency assistants can sometimes help people right away. If it's a political problem, then it comes to me, and I will do what I can to advocate, strategize, push, be nice, whatever, to try and get help for that person or address a larger issue like the conditions of WSIB right now.
Well, Lise, thanks so much for joining me on the show, and thanks for speaking out for folks here in our area, but really across the province. And you're identifying the structural inequalities in our society, I think, are a key, because you've identified a number of groups that are pushed down to the bottom. I want to remind viewers that you can catch us on Facebook, Community Conversations. We also post the show on YouTube, and that's available there. And lastly, invite everyone to join us on the day of mourning, April 28th, Friday at 5:30. Thanks so much. Stay safe.